Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze, this week in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, two segments for you all today, two data points. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the crown jewels of France that were stolen from the Louvre Museum. So stick around to hear about the economics related to all that. But first, something more directly in the immediate news, and the data point there is $760 billion. That is the value of goods traded between the U.S. and China last year. That was the highest ever, in fact, despite all the tariffs, all the sanctions, all the political tension that has become the norm in the U.S.-China trading relationship. Trying to ease that tension was the goal of the meeting that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping had on Thursday in Asia, where they tried to put the relationship on a new footing, the trade relationship, that is. They sort of described it as a strategic reset. In point of fact, it seems more like a temporary truce in a kind of trade war that is now the new norm when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. So yeah, we thought we'd try to unpack what this new truce consists of, but also the broader kind of trade war that's led to it. And yeah, one of the precipitating kind of factors of this latest flare up and the resulting resolution has been China's placement of export controls, or threat to place extra export controls on rare earth supplies that it controls and that other parts of the world depend on for all kinds of various technologies. And I wanted to ask about this control that China has over rare earths. How did that come about in the first place? I mean, why does China control these supplies in this way? How did it come about, Adam?
So, first of all, what are rare earths? We hear a lot about various types of minerals nowadays. I think ever since the sort of supply chain conversation started 5 years ago or so. I mean, they're not copper or even lithium or cobalt. They're basically 17 elements most of us have never really heard of outside the context of strategic supply chain conversations. The largest group, 15 of them, are called lanthanoids. It's like silvery white metals with names like scandium and yttrium and lithium and cerium and so on. They are used in magnets above all, and in high-tech components, in everything from iPhones to F-35 fighter jets, apparently. And the thing about them is they're not really rare in the general sense of how much there are in the Earth's crust, but they are really tricky to mine and refine above all. So they really are a product of the Cold War. So the first substantial exploitation of rare earths in the form we know it today started in California in this mountain pass mine that was discovered in the course of Cold War exploration for uranium deposits in the US. And from the 50s onwards, that one mine in California was responsible for the vast majority of global output of rare earths. So these in the 50s and 60s were extremely, unusual boutique ingredients for ultra high tech, mainly military industrial production. But from the 1980s, apparently Deng Xiaoping began to take a serious interest in them in China. And from the 1980s onwards, the Chinese very deliberately built out their capacity. And to do this, they identified the spots in China, which recur across the world, but the spots in China where you get deposits, clay, where a lot of these elements are present. And then what China did was systematically invest in and accept the cost of doing the refining of the rare earths. And that's really the reason why rare earth production has migrated away from almost all the advanced economies, is that it's extraordinarily polluting and expensive to do the refining. They tend to produce radioactive byproducts. They are altogether fairly toxic. And so societies like the US can only sustain production if there is various types of demand support, so subsidized demand, and if there is not intense competition from a lower cost producer. And though the combination of those very high costs, the lack of explicitly subsidized demand on the scale that's necessary, and the very fierce Chinese competition tipped the entire industry towards an absolute dominance on the Chinese side. And that's what's given them this commanding position. Anyone could do it if you were willing to make the investment. These are not, it's not like a copper mine where, I mean, finding copper deposits around the world is difficult, and then you have to invest billions to build a large-scale copper mine, and it takes years and years and years before they come on stream. Rare earth refining is a much lower cost operation in terms of investment, but to make it a viable industry, you need to exclude competition, you need to build subsidy, and you need to find some way of handling all the environmental costs of the refining.
Yeah. And it does seem like part of what the United States is trying to do with this year's truce is to find alternative sources and perhaps make the investments necessary to do so elsewhere in the world. We'll see how that works out. But in the meantime, it does seem like China was conscious about its control over these supplies and was conscious about the dependence of other countries on its supplies, and was willing to kind of use that in the context of this trade war. And I'm curious whether this amounts to a strategy and a new strategy for China. In other words, um, is this a weaponizing of dependence, to use a phrase that sometimes comes up in this context? In some sense, did China develop this controlling stake in rare earth supplies in order to get this kind of political leverage that it's now been using? I mean, what's the proper context in which to understand what China is doing here?
I mean, I think it's clear that they understood the strategic value. The real puzzle is why other people didn't. They clearly did understand the strategic value. They wanted these ingredients for their own production. They're their own largest customers, and they have, as is true for all the other minerals they've been interested in, they secure supply chains because they have very large scale production, say, of batteries. Um, so there was clearly strategic intent. This does give them a tactical weapon, and they have used it. This is the third time. So the first incident was in 2010 over the disputes with the Japanese over the Senkaku island chain, with a Chinese person being detained by the Japanese authorities, and the Chinese immediately rationed supply. That was 2010. So that's before Xi, in the immediate aftermath of 0809, and is widely seen as one of the first incidences of China using its economic heft for geopolitical purposes. Then they did in 2019, after the first Trump administration ramped up trade pressure on China, in the context at that point of an overt discourse in Washington, D.C. about great power geopolitical competition. The Chinese again began to talk very assertively about the possibility of shutting down rare earth supplies. These are not huge markets. Copper's hundreds and 150 billion plus. This is a market of 1/10 maybe the size of that. So it's not the economic effect. It's really the engineering consequence which they are exploiting, and they're doing it deliberately. And after 2010, the next moment was 2019. And now they've done it again in 2025. So I think one has to understand it. I mean, I don't want to say the Chinese only act from a defensive posture, because that doesn't do justice to the scale of their ambition and the purpose of the regime. But I think it's probably best to think of rare earths as a weapon in their arsenal, which they draw when they feel as though they're being backed into a corner and as though they're facing sanctions or protectionism or discrimination, which is simply unacceptable. One of the real red lines this time was the idea that the Americans were going to impose a special tax on all Chinese vessels entering the United States. And Beijing made quite clear that if the Americans went ahead with that, then they were going to escalate and escalate hard. And they did. So I think that's maybe the best way to think about this. In general, the Beijing regime has a clear idea of trade as strategic, as geopolitical. They have a clear idea that they face an incumbent power in the United States that is going to push back hard. And so they are very much actively looking for ingredients of counter pressure, both to be able to pursue their own interests and to defend themselves against what they see, of course, as American attacks. And that's what's going on here. And this is a it's a hybrid economy, it's a mixed economy, but it's one in which the government ultimately has the say over all of these issues and has means of control that go all the way down. There's very little evidence of the kind of counter lobbying that we see on the chip issue, for instance, in the US, where chip makers, tech firms will quite openly push back against administration policies they don't like. In the Chinese case, it is reasonable to think of this as a single power block directed by Beijing and being able to reach down into something as technical as this to exert national policy, use this as a lever for national policy.
Yeah, this gets at something else I wanted to ask about, which is the contrast, it seems to me, in the styles of deal making that the systems of the U.S. and China currently have, the Trump system, so to speak, and the Xi system. Obviously, there was a handshake on Thursday. There was a deal announced, but in a lot of ways, it also seems a kind of unusual deal in the sense that that the details are still to be worked out, and in general, it seems like there is a contrast between the kind of personalist system that Trump has developed around himself, in which he kind of improvises and weighs in and tries to kind of intervene personally in deal making, versus what seems to be a more bureaucratic logic of China's government. I mean, I'm curious, how you would compare these methods of government, and how you would think they relate to one another.
Yeah, it was very striking. It's worth looking at the kind of video that's been released of the interactions between the two of them. I mean, what's really striking is the way from the contrast in the framing. Like Trump is there and is obviously kind of pleased as punch to be like actually meeting with Xi, and it's a big personal moment. And he's clearly been in. I mean, the very least you have to say about Trump is he enjoys being president more than most people. He's been dancing in Malaysia and been to see the Empress in Japan. Like he's having a good time, and he's arrived in Korea, and now he gets to meet his old friend Xi, and this is good news. And then they sit down, and Xi delivers this kind of statesman-like lecture. It's like the big brother lecturing the little brother and saying, look, yeah, it's good we're meeting, but we do have to understand, the world is a complicated and difficult place, and it's not surprising that the two largest economies in the world, should have moments of friction, and it's up to us. And he kind of looks at Trump, we between us have to ensure that these are managed well. And Trump's just going, I got a great deal. This was a great meeting, 12 out of 10. And she's going, change is not seen in a century. We need to understand the systemic risks here. So there's this fundamental difference in the way that they're interacting, which has got to do with A, Trump's personality, and then B, of course, the discombobulation of policymaking in Washington, D.C., because you can see Rubio and Bessent sitting next to him. Apparently, they were all struggling with the translation because they're all adjusting their earphones and looking at the things. And And Trump wants the personal moment. And there is an apparatus in the US, which, of course, is trying to do grand strategy. And there are red lines on that. And the Blackwell chips, the NVIDIA chips, are the red line. And there was some talk about Trump maybe agreeing on them. And now they've walked that back and they said, no, 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 no. There was no talk about that. So they are, I think, trying to contain the damage. I think I would say there are like three modes right now. There is this weird thing that's going on in the US where there is this highly personalistic policy regime around Trump, and then remnants of the state apparatus, which themselves are undergoing a kind of MAGA change. I mean, Besant, after all, has brought MAGA to Treasury. Rubio is, absolutely he's pursuing this hard right project. There is the CCP, which has its policy processes ultimately utterly centered on Xi, but formulated in a completely different tone, right? When Xi sits in the big meetings, he just has the badge on like everyone else. Everyone knows he's number one, but it's framed within a power structure that he has an interest in maintaining the optics of. And then the third thing is like what used to be rules-based trade policy, which are neither of those two things, right? There's recently this coalition formed of small states. I think it involves New Zealand, the Emirates, maybe Singapore. And the logic there is to say, we want lawyers back in the room. We just want everything to be lawyered out here. We don't want either, the giant CCP apparatus or this, whatever we're going to call it, like this clown show in DC. We want systematic argumentation around the known parameters of modern trade policy. And they're actually pushing this as a coalition, as an alternative to either of those two options. But you're right, like there are clashes of style right now which are intense. And it's very difficult to see how this stabilizes, because for Trump, I mean, he wants to do this every year, whereas everyone else, he's said like, no, this is great, we get to do this every year now, like, and it's just like, I've got a date with Xi next year, it's super. Whereas everyone else is going, no, we want a framework. Can we please just settle this down and like decide, because we actually have to make large scale business decisions, and it's very difficult to do that if you're on a rolling time horizon of 6 to 9 months, and it's all just about this conditionality.
Yeah, I mean, it does strike me that maybe the Chinese system could also use, or one could reflect some more about what the Chinese system consists of, because there is so much commentary on how Trump makes decisions, or the chaos surrounding decisions he makes. But yeah, it is interesting, the sort of combination of bureaucracy in the Chinese system, but it also how that relates to the kind of authoritarianism that also exists in that system. Clearly Xi gets his way, like, I guess but how that, I guess, filters down into that system.
It's more, I like to think of it as like, I think it's quite like a large language model. It's quite like an algo. And Xi prompts it and he sets the prompts, but what comes out is algo language. Like, what comes out is CCP talk. And they'll point it in a certain direction, and Xi will very much be responsible for saying, we're going in this direction now. I don't know, the big decisions on real estate, for instance, or like tech, or green policy. But it works through an algo where there's an awful lot of equations that have to be solved before you come up with whatever language it is. And there is an impulse, and it's being prompted and pushed in a certain direction. But you have to solve all of those equations. You can't just declare something. You have to solve all of those equations.
Yeah, but there's still a prompt giver. The kind of
absolutely is a prompt giver, and a huge part of the system's operation is the people at lower levels trying to anticipate what that prompt's going to be. It is quite, if you think of the CCP as a giant LLM designed to flatter Xi in the same way as LLMs tend to flatter us as users, that might be one way of thinking about what's going on here. But with like 100 million people actually in the apparatus constantly trying to, figure out like what their relationship are to those prompts that come down and how you interpret them properly.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just interesting to have this metaphor. I guess it's
Yeah, now we've
natural.
got it. Like, yeah.
I mean,
It's
like in terms of political theory, that we used to like sort of. I remember talk about who is the kind of legislator in like the
yeah.
legislator in a system, and now it's the prompt giver. It's
Who's the
its own.
prompter? Yeah.
Um, but um, but I guess to return to this trade war context, I mean, one thing that strikes me also about this discourse in the U.S. is there's a contrast of its own between the I don't know the really historical stakes that sometimes get portrayed in this trade war, and that it's about kind of control over technology and rival hegemons and the course of history ultimately, um, and that's all on one hand, and then on the other hand, the trade talks always seem to come down to soybeans ultimately, like basically, uh, uh, you know, farmers and how many soybeans they're selling, and the need to make sure that they're selling enough soybeans in the United States to China. And I'm curious what you make about that kind of contrast,
Yeah.
the stakes involved, and whether there's a kind of fundamental incoherence about the stakes of this trade war that comes out in that context.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, just kind of double down on this tension. Like, why does it come down to soybeans? It comes down to soybeans because Chinese people like to eat pork so much, and so they have this giant herd of of pigs, which expanded really dramatically after the reform period as people's income started going up. And so you need to feed the pigs something. And there was a huge push. American trade policy was very influential in the 90s and the 2000s to open up the Chinese animal feed market to global exporters. And on the back of that, the American soy producers, but also the great South American soy producers, but above all, of course, the Brazilians, started expanding soy cultivation to feed the Chinese appetite for pork. Basically, that's what's hanging on this, and that really, let's not, this is no joke. If there is one economic indicator that Beijing really pays attention to, it's the price of pork. I mean, they literally have a watch on that, and if that goes up, they think they've got inflation. So for them, what the gas price is in the US, the petrol price, the pork prices in China. So it's a key variable. But you agree? I completely agree. There's this huge discrepancy. I mean, let's just give people the news. The news is that China is going to buy 12 million metric tons of American soy by the end of the year, and fellow citizens, rejoice, rejoice. Over the coming years, China will be buying 25 million tons, and which is not exactly where we were pre-trade war, but it's back from the lowest levels. And for the farm states of the US, that's extremely good news, and that's how this feeds back in, right? Is that the farm states are key electoral stakes, especially for the Republicans, and this is what anchors the concern. Trump is famously sensitive to farm votes. Actually, he will have these kind of moments of reflection where he'll go, "Oh, but they voted for me. They love me." And you know the way he is, like he loves to be loved. So like they love me there. I should do good things for them. And so he's passionately committed to delivering on this. And it's, as you say, like crazily at odds with the discourse, which is world historic change, tech wars, chips, and all of a sudden we're talking about pigs and beans. The thing is, though, that we shouldn't be too kind of highbrow about this. I mean, if you think about America's position in the world going back to the 19th century, this is key. These logics are absolutely key. The internationalists, such as they were in American politics through the mid 20th century, were the farm lobby, right? The farm lobby were the export orientated chunk of the US economy. The manufacturing sector, until it acquired global dominance by the late 19th, early 20th century, was massively protectionist. That was the Republican protectionist northeastern industrial bloc that was, it's simplistic to call it isolationist, but it was protectionist, and it was basically betting on the development of the American national economy. It's the plantation economy, the cotton economy of the South originally, and then the Midwestern farm states that push. and they underpin America's rise to globalism. Like the farm lobby is key to the Marshall Plan. Like, these things that we think of as great acts of American statesmanship in Congress, they depend on those kind of constituencies. At Yale, where we were both, the Macmillan Center, the great Center for International Studies at Yale, is endowed by the Macmillan family. And what are the Macmillan family? They're from Minnesota and they own Cargill. Like, and Cargill is one of the great grain trading businesses in the world, and they have a profoundly cosmopolitan outlook. So, rather than thinking of soybeans as the mundane, the trivial, you could think of the soybeans as the material reality of the universal. What does everyone want? The vast majority of people worldwide quite like to eat pork meat, and that's what's sustained by soybeans, and that's why soybeans matter. The Chinese would say it's a human right to eat pork, and the soybean is the material instantiation of the human right to enjoy pork.
Who do you think has the upper hand in a U.S.-China trade war? It doesn't seem like the kind of, again, trade war is over. It's just sort of on pause. You know, who ultimately, I guess, is dependent on whom here, and yeah, how should we be thinking about who has the advantage?
I mean, the opinion today in all the American media I've been able to read since the end of the meeting in Korea is unambiguously that the Chinese have emerged the stronger here. Now, this is overwhelmingly liberal journalists writing, and of course, they're happy to find fault with President Trump, and there's almost a kind of relish in his self humiliation. But that seems to be overwhelmingly the opinion. And now that this is like one phase of a protracted game, and in the end, after all, the Chinese are responding to American aggression, so the Americans are on the front foot. Part of the problem of American policy is they've been so indiscriminately aggressive that they have now a high level of tariffs on all possible substitutes for China. And so if you don't keep the Chinese tariffs at a really quite high level, what will tend to happen is that the production will relocate to China. So the Americans, you could say, are becoming the victims of their own success in other negotiations. In the end, we are also talking about the Chinese trying as hard as they can to gain access to what Donald Trump rather endearingly referred to as the super duper NVIDIA chips, which, they don't make themselves. So structurally, the Chinese have these levels of dependence, are in the end reacting to American aggression. But if the idea was that America was going to be able to straightforwardly impose its will on the Chinese, and that the Chinese would come to the table with a large array of very significant concessions, we're not seeing that. And what we are seeing is a relatively self-confident Beijing that basically gave precious little ground on any of the key issues, and has simply said, okay, fine, if let's play nice around the rare earths, we can do that if you like, but does it fundamentally shift the structural balance? No. So I would say this is kind of I think the Chinese are ahead on points at this point. It's not a knockout by any means, but they are ahead on points.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good metaphor, I think, as well. A boxing match that is not over yet, but we're several rounds in. I guess we'll see how it continues. I imagine this isn't the last time we're talking about it on this podcast either, but we should take a break here, and we will return to talk about the Louvre and the crown jewels of France. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is 88 million, as in 88 million euros. That is the value assigned by French prosecutors to the crown jewels that were stolen from the Louvre on October 19th, a couple weeks ago. Um, yeah, this was a kind of brazen daylight raid on probably the world's most famous museum. The thieves got into the museum, yeah, during the middle of the day, managed to get away with those jewels worth 88 million euros. It only took them 8 minutes. Several suspects have been arrested. The jewels have not been recovered, but we thought we'd try to unpack the general economics related to all of this. And to start off with, Adam, as a naive American, what are crown jewels in the first place? I mean, clearly this is jewelry, but what is the function of crown jewels? And yeah, like how does a state pay for them? I mean, it's sort of like is this just tax money spent on jewelry? Is that the way to make sense of how crown jewels work?
So, when a king becomes a king, there's a thing called a coronation, a procedure called a coronation, and that's really the moment at which the crown jewels perform their essential ceremonial function. And there are three which I think are generally in the Christian tradition seen as absolutely elemental to kingship or queenship, and that is the crown, the orb, and the scepter. So if you look at medieval depictions of kings, you will commonly see them with a crown on their head, a globe with a cross on it, and a staff. And so the globe is the orb, and the scepter is the staff. And those three items are, holding them at the crucial moment. This is almost always in a cathedral with a high spiritual authority going in the Christian tradition, going back to Charlemagne, inaugurated as the Holy Roman Emperor in 800s by the Pope. This is the kind of theocratic moment where the power of religion is melded with the power of the secular authority to form the king or emperor. These are very precious objects. Probably the most significant surviving ones in the world right now, maybe this is my Anglophone, my British bias speaking, might be the British crown jewels. They have checkered histories. So if you have a revolution, as in the British case, in the 1640s, the English Revolution, the overthrowing of the monarchy, the medieval crown jewels in England, which went back to Edward the Confessor, so back to the early medieval period, were broken down and sold off by the Republic, the short-lived Republic, and then a new set of crown jewels were purchased and manufactured in the 1660s. And interestingly, because you only need these, with any luck, every couple of decades. The crown was just the gold frame, so it's a band with a cross across, and the jewels were rented. Like for every new coronation, they would go to the jewel merchants of London and put jewels onto the crown, and then hand them back to the jewel merchants after the coronation had happened. The authority was vested in the crown, and it's really in the moment of the invention of modern British tradition, which is the late Victorian, turn of the century, Gilded Age moment, that by this point they're emperors of the British Empire worldwide. The royal house decides that this isn't good enough, and so the modern crown jewels that you can see in the Tower of London were zhuzhed up at that moment, and one of the largest diamonds ever discovered was put into the scepter. And so that's how a classic European set of crown jewels comes to exist. The French history is even more checkered, of course, because of their multiple revolutionary history. The original set that go back to the House of Bourbon and the Louis XIV and all the way back were broken up by the Third Republic in the 1880s. So what the Louvre was displaying were fragments of monarchical history. I think the most crown-like object that was stolen was in fact Napoleon III's. So this is the nephew of Napoleon I, who himself was a total kind of Kardashian-style parvenu. That is the most significant crown-like object, and the rest were necklaces, various types of jewelry, more conventional jewelry that were purchased for glamorous display functions. largely in the 19th century. So late 19th century, most of this stuff was Bonapartist, was mid 19th century. The original, really medieval crown jewels of France were disposed of years ago by the Third Republic. In the 1880s, I think they were broken up.
I mean, maybe to clarify, for my sake, the ownership questions involved here. I mean, like when there are crown jewels, is it the
king,
monarch that
the monarch.
owns the
Yeah.
jewels, and
Yeah.
it's a personal
It's
ownership?
absolutely personal. Yeah, and because that's the nature of monarchical states, right? That it's only over the course of the modern period that the state gets fully separated from the household of the monarch and from literally the body of the monarch, right? The whole point of the coronation is that this object descends on the body of, God help us, like, Charles III of Britain, and that's what makes him, that man, that body, king. And if you look on the website of the Tower of London, where the images are displayed of the crown jewels, the copyright is to Charles III on the image.
Huh. And I guess eventually this gets transposed to a kind of modern, constitutional monarchical state, with the relevant bureaucratic understandings of ownership and the state, and in this particular instance, in reading about this, I was struck by how it was repeatedly described that France was the French state was its own insurer of these jewels. The jewels were not otherwise insured; they were insured by the state itself. And I'm just curious what that phrase even means. I found that curious. I mean, to be your own insurer, does that just mean they weren't insured at all? I mean, how to make sense of that phrase?
So it's very interesting. Like insurance, the essence of insurance is that you delegate some of the risk of something that can happen to you to somebody else. And then that can take lots of different forms, public, private, but it's always about involving someone else or some group of other people. So classically, a Lloyd's insurance syndicate, something like that. So you have a bunch of rich people who basically decide to take a gamble on certain sorts of risk. And there are various settings where you can't really effectively do that. So in big macroeconomics, we talk about emerging markets self-insuring against the risk of financial crisis by building foreign exchange reserves. So they hold the foreign exchange reserves for the event of a shock, and they've insured themselves by paying the cost of holding the reserves all of that time. And in this case, yes, the French Republic has a official policy by law. The great museum collections of France, which are maybe the greatest, certainly some of the largest in the world, are prohibited from taking out private insurance. I guess basically it's a way also of guarding against the fact they would simply be exploited in the insurance business, which, what is the price of insuring the Mona Lisa or whatever? Like, the costs would be exorbitant. And so effectively what that means is the Louvre would be indemnified, insofar as this makes any sense, by the French Treasury, which ultimately the great art treasures of France, many of which, of course, were pillaged in Italy under Napoleon. The great Louvre collection is hugely amplified in the Napoleonic period by. That is all assets of the French state, now the French Republic, and the only kind of insurance that exists is essentially within that aggregate. And that effectively means that in kind of layperson's terms, they're not insured. And this is just a loss to the French taxpayer.
Got it. Yeah. It's interesting that phrase lingers, though. It's some sort of kind of like suggestion of
it may have a meaning
protection
within the balance sheet of the French state. In the same way as if the central bank holds a huge portfolio of treasuries and interest rates go up and the value of those treasuries goes down, the central banks will book losses, and then in some cases they will be indemnified by the treasury for those losses. But they're all essentially on the public balance sheet. So the Louvre may have a claim against the French treasury.
Yeah, that's, I guess, what I would have said upon thinking about it, that it almost sort of suggests that the state is obliged to address this loss. Like it's obliged to somehow
Acknowledge it.
acknowledge it and make it whole, and it can't simply let it be a loss. But yeah, beyond that, it seems not to mean much of anything. But but I guess to follow where these stolen jewels may end up, it seems like the suggestion is they were stolen in order to be broken down and for the constituent kind of jewels and precious metals to be introduced to the black market. And I'm just curious how that happens, and what is the economy related to doing so? Is there an economy dedicated to kind of getting stolen materials and art into the black market?
There is. It's a substantial market. I mean, so substantial that in the 2000s, the FBI established a specialized unit to deal with it. This was after the catastrophe of the pillaging of the great Baghdad museums after the American and British invasion in 2003. We think about 15,000 objects went quote unquote missing. Um, it's a market that's estimated, below drugs and weapons. It's kind of like maybe the third of the great illicit markets. It's believed, it's hard to credit, but tens of thousands of art objects go missing every year and feed into this market. So it's really large. The striking thing is that art figures as prominently in the imagination both of the public and of thieves as it does, because it's the hardest thing to do anything with. It's much easier to break up a complicated piece of 19th century jewelry and sell off the individual components. There is right now, as people will know, so some of the segment we should do probably, of the gold market has gone crazy. And so there have been a series of very serious thefts. Perhaps the most terrible in terms of art historical loss was a raid on a Dutch located exhibition of priceless archaeological artifacts from Romania of the Dacian civilization that were displayed for the first time, I think, outside Romania in the Netherlands. And a gang, much more professional gang, earlier this year raided that museum. They used explosives to blow their way in. They did it in the dead of night. It's a much more serious operation. And we're talking about millennia old gold artifacts that are most likely just being melted down for their gold value. I mean, it's horrifying to think about. But the vast majority of objects are not of that type. They are the sort of things that you can see in the Getty Museum. The Getty Museum is thought to be probably the largest repository of recently stolen artifacts, which were looted from Italy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and put on the market. And Getty apparently used his yacht. One of the things he liked to do was to use it for little shopping trips to Italy where they would pick up artifacts. Their most famous bronze statue has recently been formally identified as the result of theft by the highest European court. So we should expect that to be going back to Italy. So that was a ruling in 2024, and it's a series. We've spoken about various elements of this chain. Generally speaking, what happens is that people do, illegal excavations in Italy. The objects are then slowly laundered. They often go via about 3 ports in Switzerland, and they will then emerge on the market after various sorts of laundering transactions, which are intended to make it look as though it didn't just come out of the ground, and will then find their way to a legitimate auction house where you hope, fingers crossed, that it's not picked up. And that then gives it that's the crucial hurdle you have to cross, or it's a private transaction. But there are very substantial amounts of these kind of artifacts in private collections. Obviously, you can't do with the Rembrandt or Leonardo da Vinci because there's just too few of them. But if you're talking about classical artifacts, which come out of the ground, where we don't really have a complete inventory to start with, and so it's possible to basically create legends around them, it's a much more open market for this kind of black market dealing in illegal archaeology.
Yeah, I did like that phrase, the great illicit markets. Sort of, there's something noble sounding about that. Like the Great Lakes and the I don't know. But yeah, like maybe it does strike me that there seems to be an uptick in these kinds of museum thefts. Maybe that's purely anecdotal, but it does seem like these kinds of thefts of artworks is on the rise in various European countries, at least. And I'm curious if there might be an economic reason for that specifically. I mean, is there maybe more demand for these objects? You mentioned the gold market as maybe one specific aspect of that, or in a broader context, it struck me that maybe there might be a lack of other targets for theft. We're in a more cashless society, so I don't know. Maybe robbing banks or stores is less attractive to get one's hands on cash, and all of a sudden, museums become relatively a more attractive target for people who are thinking about stealing things. But yeah, how should we sort of think about this trend in some economic terms?
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea that these are like the ultimate non-fungible objects, and so they become more attractive in a world of abstraction, digitization. Um, I think that logic is real. I mean, the art market in this particular moment is actually in a slump, so it's not. You're not. You wouldn't expect it on that basis. I think the precious metal value is something. Diamonds are also in a huge slump because of the vast boom in synthetic diamond production. So some of those logics will be cutting the other way. I think maybe two things to say. One is that it's totally clear that, yes, over the last 50 years, art theft has a cycle, and that cycle, so it has a history, and that history is linked to broader macroeconomic conditions or geopolitical events. I alluded to the pillaging of the Baghdad museums. In terms of sort of public media attention to art theft, it's really the 1970s when the modern art theft business gets going. And that would be a moment that would fit your story, Cam, in the sense it was a moment of inflation. So non-fungible objects, real values increase. That increases the incentive. And I think the other point I would put in play right now is the disproportion between the value of these objects and the resources available to the museums to actually protect them. I mean, the Louvre is essentially massively under protected. So it's a kind of combination of market forces on the one hand, this public collection of assets that sit on the French government's balance sheet from that's the insurance part of this, and austerity, which for decades has basically deprived public cultural institutions of the basic investments that would be necessary to protect those public assets. So you have a kind of dynamized entrepreneurial criminal space. You have these piles of assets sitting conspicuously on the public balance sheet, and you have decades of penny pinching budgetary constraint on the giant museum, the biggest museum in the world, the Louvre, by size, um, underinvestment, underspending on those same institutions. So we could have a kind of, let's blame neoliberalism.
That's
we
convenient.
could just make the long story short and blame neoliberalism. It's neoliberalism and austerity. It creates this disparity, and that would explain it all.
Well, add that to the ledger of reasons to get rid of neoliberalism. You might get your artworks back. But I guess for now we should wrap this conversation up. We will be back, as always, next week with a couple of new topics, and see you all then.